Welcome to Liberty Law Talk, part of Liberty Fund's online library of law and liberty. Your host is Liberty Fund Fellow Richard Reinsch. Our website is libertylawtalk.org, where you can subscribe, comment, find other episodes and links relevant to today's conversation. Our email address is mail@libertylawtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Today we are discussing with Russell Hittinger, Jacques Maritain's Scholasticism and Politics, which Liberty Fund has recently republished. Russell Hittinger is the William K. Warren Professor of Catholic Studies at the University of Tulsa. He is the author of numerous books, including Thomas Aquinas and the Rule of Law, The First Grace, Rediscovering the Natural Law in a Post-Christian Age, and he is currently at work on Paper Wars, Catholic Social Doctrine and the Modern State, that will be published by Yale University Press. Well, Russ, welcome to Liberty Law Talk.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
Russ, good to have you. We're talking about Maritain's Scholasticism and Politics, but his body of work is truly incredible. Metaphysics, philosophy, political philosophy, aesthetics, social questions, education theory. Among other things, he was also a man of action. He was heavily involved in drafting the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And this output of his ranges roughly 5 decades, from the 1920s through the 1960s. Of course, we're considering his political philosophy, which is a political philosophy not as modern practitioners of it would define it or write about it, in the sense of it is a political philosophy open to transcendental questions, ideals, and values, and he believes that it must be if it is to be political philosophy, it seems. And also if we're going to have a political philosophy that is truly humanistic. So from the beginning, Russ, just sketch for us what Maritain is doing in this book, Scholasticism and Politics.
Okay. Well, an interesting thing to know is that Maritain did not begin in the area of practical philosophy, that is, political, moral, legal. He began in completely the opposite direction. He was born in 1882, came from a well-placed family. His mother's side of the family, some political authority within the Third Republic, which was the Republic of France at the time of his birth and much of his life until World War II. He began as a scientist, right? So he goes to school to study biology and life sciences, and even when he starts to make a turn toward philosophy, through the influence of Henri Bergson, he's totally in what I'm going to call a late modern understanding of science and philosophy. Interestingly, he began his first professorship, his first full professorship in 1921 at the Institut Catholique in Paris, holding the chair of logic and cosmology. So the first part of his life, even after his conversion to Catholicism, which is around 1906, for about 20 years, he's doing epistemology, logic, philosophy of science, philosophy of nature, and virtually nothing on moral, political, legal. And then he had a kind of conversion. In this case, it was even a quasi-religious conversion. In his young adulthood, post-1906, he got caught up with a right-wing French political movement and newspaper called Action Française. The leader of it was Charles Maurras, who was a right-wing French nationalist and a kind of positivist. He loved Auguste Comte. And Maurras taught a doctrine of what he called integral nationalism. That is, that the French must put aside their division since the French Revolution, have a monarch who would serve a kind of late modern nationalistic movement. And, well, this was pretty nasty stuff. His writings were condemned by the church. Eventually, he was actually excommunicated, 1927, but he caused all sorts of headaches for the Catholic Church in France and in Rome because he was teaching the priority of the nation to the church. And in 1925, Pope Pius XI wrote an encyclical called Quas Primas, on Christ the King, which was a thinly veiled attack by the Pope on Charles Maurras. Maritain read this and converted, separated himself from this right-wing nationalism, and from that moment, so around 1926, a year later, you'll just see a stream of his work on political questions of the day. And we have to remember, 1926, what's going on. You not only have this business in France, the left versus the right, you have Mussolini, you have the beginnings of fascist movement in Germany, you have all of the soil for what will become the Spanish Revolution and Civil War. So Maritain turned his attention to political, moral, and legal things right at the moment of crisis, and really didn't let up very much writing on these things until toward the end of his life. He dies in 1973. So we have a logician and a scientist morphing into a political theorist just in the crucible of that era.
Well, it's certainly interesting to think, excuse me, on the first page he makes a statement: my point of view is not that of the mere logic of ideas and doctrines, but that of the concrete logic of the events of history. And this seems in what you've outlined, particularly in the late 20s, and the nationalistic movement, and of course the right and the left beginning to, set upon one another. How does this help us understand his also this opening statement that he wants to investigate the crisis of modern times?
Well, Maritain was convinced. By the way, he was not the only person who took this point of view in those decades, roughly between World War I and World War II, that Western civilization had exhausted itself. A kind of moral exhaustion. And the tragedy or the crisis is that the West was unable to sustain classical humanism that we inherit from the Greco-Roman civilization, nor its more modern version, which was Enlightenment humanism, nor Christian humanism, So the three great humanisms, classical, Christian, and Enlightenment, had worn themselves out. There was a profound lack of confidence all around, and there was the rise of what he calls belligerent pessimism about what it means to be a human being, and even what could be called counter-humanisms. He puts Nietzsche among certain counter-humanists. So, in a nutshell...
Well, along these lines, he makes this statement within the context of a discussion of classical humanism, which I take it to mean something like modern liberalism. Nietzsche, Freud, and Marx, he says, have unmasked the bourgeois Pharisee. I thought that was a striking statement within also thinking about these other concepts in the book of counter-humanism, of democracy of the individual. Who is the bourgeois Pharisee according to Maritain, and what must be built upon him? What are the events of history that would spark sort of a better line of thought about the human person within modern society?
I think the underlying crisis is anthropological, so far as Maritain understands it, and that is, we have circa the 1920s, going into the 1930s, the exhaustion of the great humanisms into three rather nasty options. One is what he calls bourgeois individualism, which regards the private individual as the absolute center of society, and this produces... The only kind of order this can produce is an order of aggregation, not a true public order with a common good. Then you have communist anti-individualism, which means human beings aren't really even human beings yet because they're still alienated. And they also produce nothing but an aggregation imposed by the state or the party. And then you have what he calls the combination of the two, which is fascist anti-individualism and anti-communism. So these three options, which have a lot of political traction in those 2 decades, have only individuals, and on the other side, some display or projection of power to organize them. And they're producing, inevitably, governments that don't really govern, but are basically in the business of crowd control, is what they're doing. And authority is being reduced to force. So individualism, according to Maritain, leads to the same place, maybe more gently in the case of bourgeois individualism, and perhaps more violently in the case of the fascist. But if you start with individuals who can only be aggregated, in all 3 cases, it means that order can only arise by a kind of despotic projection of power. And so that's the crisis. This is not a humanism. In fact, they have a negative anthropology. We cannot say what man truly is. And the bourgeois individualist cannot say what man truly is, because that would limit man's freedom and his privacy to have his own opinion. The communist can't say what man truly is, because man has not even appeared yet. We can only say what man is not. He's not what we see around us, these alienated individuals. And the fascists can't say what man truly is, because man is subsumed under race in the nation. So we could use the phrase, by the way, this phrase was used by Karl Wojtyła, eventually of John Paul II, who read Maritain deeply in the 1940s. John Paul II called it negative anthropology. We can affirm what man is not, but not what he is.
Build for us, what is, when Maritain uses the term integral humanism, what is he talking about there? What's he building from? And also in thinking about, moving into political philosophy proper, which, this book is I guess ostensibly a work of political philosophy, but one that is really concerned with the person, the nature of freedom, and the sort of existential pre-commitments that people have to make, it seems, for there to be a tolerable and decent regime. What is he building from in this discussion?
Of course, this is the title of what's probably his most famous work that appeared in 1935. So about 3 years before the lectures for this book that Liberty Fund has republished, Integral Humanism. I find in the essays in Scholasticism and Politics, we don't get a sharp definition of it compared to the book, but I can take a stab at it. First of all, the title. The title is a reaction against Charles Maurras and Action Française, which advocated integral nationalism. And we could say that the Nazis advocate integral racialism, pan-German, integral German identity. And perhaps we could, in any way, so the term integral actually meant something in those days because it was being used by the other sides. So that's the title. But integral humanism is the ability to understand the human being in 2 dimensions. First of all, the human being as a whole, not just the sum of its parts, not just a material thing being moved around by a motor. The human being as whole, as more than the sum of its parts, both having material individuality and having an intellective soul, a unity of those 2 things as a whole, and also understanding society, now, human society as a whole, more than the sum of its parts. And he has a very succinct formula for that. Man in society is a whole within a whole. So integral humanism does not sacrifice the individual whole to the society, nor does it subordinate the society to the individual, but has a kind of a relation of subsidiarity, of being a whole of wholes. And I think that's the basic formula, which he then tries to work out in much more detail in the 1935 book, but in some very interesting ways in these essays as well.
Thinking of, and I know we've kind of scratched this already, he has this bifurcation, democracy of the individual versus democracy of the person. And he does this before introducing his more, elaborate reflections, refined reflections on the nature of democracy and what it should contain. The democracy of the individual, I take it, goes back to your earlier discussion of the attempt to, within modern democracies, modern states, to kind of, agglomerate these different persons one on top of one another, and somehow everything kind of cashes out. Everyone is left on their own, but you've kind of also stacked everyone's good on top of one another, and you should have kind of a peaceful society. And yet, this wasn't really Maritain's experience in Europe at the time. But how does this democracy of the individual and democracy of the person relate to another concept he has, which is democracy and authority, and that democracies seem to lack legitimacy? I mean, they have, in fact, legitimacy, but they seem to lack something much more substantial.
When we talk about individual human beings in some kind of an order with one another, we have three options, basically. And by the way, they all go back to Aristotle, it seems to me. The first option is to understand people simply as an aggregation of individuals who have a kind of accidental unity. You could think of a bunch of people waiting in a queue to get a bus. Every one of them is an individual person, but there is no social order to it. In other words, they don't, by waiting in line, constitute a social union of any kind. It's an aggregational unit. It's like people going through a shopping mall. Okay. It's like a heap of sand. I think Aristotle called it unity of composition. It's entirely accidental. But we have a slightly higher option here, which is to consider human beings as individuals who are partners. So, for instance, I put into TIAA-CREF a retirement account for teachers, and all the other teachers are putting into TIAA-CREF. We pool our resources, creating a kind of aggregation of resources, but we have to cooperate to do it. And there's some cooperation is necessary, and some rule of law is necessary for doing this. But the ultimate goal of partnership is private yield, right? Each one of us justifiably wants our private yield. The third option would be we enter into a society that has a truly and indivisible common good that is neither an aggregation nor a pooling device for private yield, but is something that exists so that it's never consumed. So ideally, that's what a marriage is, that's what a political order is, that's what a church is. You can't take it with you. You can't cash it out, as it were. You either participate in it or you don't have the it at all. So just to summarize that line of thought, think of a line of people waiting in a queue, the same 10 people. They are parts of the queue, but as members of a credit union, they are partners, but they're members of St. Rita's Parish. And we notice with an entity like the United States or France or a church, in these cases, that entity does not change by reconfiguring the aggregation. Someone's born, someone dies, France remains France, right? And so forth. For any true social union, it has a kind of immortality to it because the common good is not something divisible. And I'll give one more example. our courts understand perfectly well that at time of divorce, they can divide the properties, common properties, things that have been pooled. So the husband gets the channel changer and the wife gets the drapes or something. But a court understands acutely that it can't divide the marriage. You can't send one spouse away with 45% of the marriage and the other one away with 65%. If someone changes their country or nationality, you can't take American citizenship with you. If we have a social order that cannot be divisible in that way, we have a social order. And Maritain's claim is that, individualism produces either pure aggregation, people waiting for a bus kind of thing, or it can produce, especially in its liberal mode, some very impressive modes of partnership. It doesn't have the resources for sustaining a common good that's indivisible and can't be cashed out.
So this would be one way to think of Maritain's comment, reflection that somehow bourgeois liberalism has led to the absolute primacy of the state. In the course of reflecting upon Nazism, the state realizes man, or communism. I guess this would be more of somehow man's telos is found in a historical evolutionary process where somehow we all come together around economic organization and find our end. Maritain, in a way, kind of sounds like Robert Nisbet in the sense of somehow complete individualism ends in complete despotism, it seems.
Yeah, and we can get soft or hard versions of that despotism. I mean, individualism can produce some soft versions, and I think the Anglo-American experience with this has, on the whole, been rather soft, whereas French Revolution, Bolshevism produces some really hard despotisms. But make no mistake, a soft despotism is very hard to correct because it proceeds from the assumption that human beings are not naturally capable of a social unity that's not mere pooling or aggregation. And if they're not capable by nature or inclined by nature to a higher kind of social unity, then social unity is going to have to be by force.
It seems also, in thinking of Maritain's distinction between the democracy of the individual and democracy of the person, and then also when he talks about freedom, there's free will, but there's also something else, freedom of spontaneity, freedom of exaltation, he calls it, which is the higher use of our freedom. But of course, it's not the individual. The individual is, as you were saying, the individual and the person are both one in the sense of they work together, but the individual ultimately gives way to the person, and the person becomes the basis, if I'm reading him correctly, of our broader use of freedom. But thinking of that, it seems those who value freedom frequently look at this exaltation of the common good and cringe, and also we've seen common good or terms like social justice misused and really mean kind of a diminution of the individual in favor of state power. What's the distinction Maritain would make there? And understanding also he's not someone who comes from kind of an Anglo-liberal background. I would take it he's probably not someone in favor of purely a free market, but yet in favor of free markets generally speaking. So how does he make those distinctions?
By the way, he absolutely adored American constitutional order and wrote, actually, in my view, a bit too enthusiastically about it. But what he loved about the American experiment is that it relied so explicitly on civil brotherhood, and that it was not just the unilateral projection of state authority that moves human beings into some kind of a social unity. He loved that about the United States. By the way, he really liked the American Supreme Court. That there was judgment. It embodies judgment, not just projection of force. Whereas in many Western European governments, courts are basically elite groups that are immediately a projection of state power. Maritain just adored the United States. So when you see him, by the way, using terms like bourgeois individualism, in other writings you should see what he says about the American experiment, which of course he saw in the 40s, right? And he comes over to the United States and lives here for a while. And of course he doesn't see what we have today. So keeping that in mind, well, here's the basic distinction he makes about freedom. That freedom of choice is the most free freedom because it can't exist without freedom from constraint and freedom from necessity. In other words, if you really were to badger someone and restrain them or waterboard them or whatever you're going to do, I mean, you've just destroyed the conditions of the possibility of a free choice. For free choice to be free, it has to be without immediate coercion. And number two, free choice has to be free of necessity. That is, if there's only one way to do something, you don't have much free choice about it, right? But he said, this utterly spectacular power or activity called free choice is less perfect than freedom ordained to a higher freedom, which in Latin I think would be called libertas. It's a condition of being free. Not just being able to act freely in the sense of choice, but to be free. Example, we take Brady, the quarterback of the Patriots. He's not having to make free choices continually to play well in a coordinated way. In his activity as quarterback, he's simply free in that action because of the perfections he's acquired and the habits he's acquired. I'd like to tell my students this, if you have to make continually free choices to engage yourself in studies, you will almost certainly feel and experience a lack of freedom. You're not free in studying. You're constantly having to cold boot yourself by free choice into this activity. So a condition of actually being free, the enjoyment of a good and a set of activities, is a higher freedom. I mean, I suppose this is Aristotelian. Free choices build up habits by which the soul develops a character that's free in those actions. And everyone wants the second. Now, what is the role of government in this second type of freedom? It's to provide such order and indirectly training of its citizens so that they can acquire this higher freedom. And actually, I don't see how that idea is very controversial, or at least so put, the way I just put it. Can government immediately, through the exercise of the powers of law, make someone free in the second sense? No. But it's certainly something to be aimed at. But government certainly immediately is to protect the first freedom, the freedom of free choice, by removing false necessities from our lives, by removing inappropriate restraints and coercions, doing things by law rather than with a billy club. So I think Maritain's view is that government flourishes in its activities most in that first freedom, protecting it, encouraging it, indirectly guiding it, but it's for the sake of something beyond free choice.
So the common good, the way he describes it, I take it wouldn't be something one or is able to bring down from the clouds into the city. I mean, this is kind of an Aristotelian discovery process that a particular culture, group, society, state has to make on its own as to how they will organize their own freedoms. And this is interesting discussion, I thought, where he talks about organizing freedoms as a way to think about the common good, as opposed to kind of the way we think about the common good, which seems to be something of we need more welfare state entitlements or things like this. But organization of freedoms also kind of seems to track back to his discussion about he seems to acknowledge the skepticism people have about representative government and self-government, in the sense of the masses. What are you going to do? You turn the power over to them, et cetera, give them more of a franchise. And he says, yes, precisely, but that comes back to something else, which is education. And I take it civic brotherhood, civil society, that life. But of course, this is also something that seems hard to rebuild, given the condition many Western societies are in. I was wondering, where did he stand, or did he take a position? I assume he did, in the early integrating efforts of Europe. I suppose it would be the European coal and steel market, but also those who tried to form a European Union of sorts around cultural, civic, religious values.
Oh, he's very, very important. By the way, his 1951 book, Man and the State, which was being written even during these immediate post-1945 years. By the way, he gave that at the University of Chicago. The first 50 pages of that book are the most blistering critique you will ever read of the Leviathan state. I mean, it's just blistering. Maritain was a pluralist and a kind of federalist, if I can use those terms broadly, which means that he thought at every level of society, the household, the clubs and associations, local political units like municipalities, larger federal or national units, and then even world units, he argued strenuously that his fellow Europeans had to learn the lessons of World War I and World War II, and not in the destruction of Europe capitulate to the temptation to create a Leviathan state. And so those first stirrings of European Union, most people don't know this, but they were led by Catholic Thomists. Schumann on the French side, Konrad Adenauer on the German side, they had read Maritain. And the first stirrings of European Union was not to create a mega state. It was to protect all of the subsidiary societies, and with an emphasis especially on religious-moral values, which they didn't think they had to impose back then. It's not like our culture war disputes in our country today. Because in the late 1940s, anyway, for any sane European, the lesson had been learned. And they were much more capable of bringing back some of their Christian humanism. So it didn't have this threatening feel of, well, let's be bound by our common cultural, moral, and religious values. We don't have to create one huge administrative unit out of this. That was relatively uncontroversial, and Maritain is one of the two or three most important thinkers on the Catholic side who was weighing in on this question constantly. And one more thing to say. In the 30s and in the 40s, Maritain was regarded by many Catholics as a bit suspicious because of just what you mentioned, that it's the organization of liberty that's most important. It's not just any kind of order. It's not just order in cattle and food processing, or order in fresh air, or order in things. The most important order is order in freedom. And what that meant for some Catholics, especially on the right, is that Maritain was advocating a priority of liberty, at least ordered liberty, and number two, he was a pluralist. That is, there can be more than one kind of political regime that satisfies this. Not everyone has to be organized into Swiss cantons. France is the opposite of Switzerland. Germany is the mega federalist country in Europe. There can be plural experiments in forms of regime and even in modes of democracy. By the late 1940s, Maritain, I think, has won this battle for the soul of the Catholic mind on this, because by the late 1940s, it's clear to almost everyone that these two things were the main things that had to be done: ordered liberty and a pluralism of regime. And by the way, a double pluralism of regime, because not only different constitutions, but within those subsidiary units that have their own proper liberties and unities, what Catholics call subsidiarity. So Maritain began as a kind of liberal in the Catholic context. I say kind of, but by the 50s, you can see his thought just directly playing into the Second Vatican Council. So
it seems important. There's also a discussion in the book of pluralism in certain parts, and it seems to me, and just simplifying here, it's not a pluralism of indifference or pluralism of we all just disagree, but it's, we are all actively searching for what's right, for what's good as we see it, according to various circumstances, exigencies, etc. And the pluralism, allows us a space to do this and not come to loggerheads or swift disagreements with those around us. It seems to me that's a more nobler way to think about pluralism and a better grounding.
Yes, let's call it a pluralism of perfection. That is, the reason we have a pluralism of ways of life, organizations, initiatives, is not only for the sake of efficiency, although we shouldn't rule out efficiency, by the way, but it's also for the sake of the perfections of the agents. So think of something like education. If the parents were to outsource all of their children's education, it might be more efficient from one point of view, but what would be missing is the perfection in the parents themselves, who perform acts of teaching. So pluralism is important for efficiency, to be sure, but it's also important because it allows more people in different ways to exercise their own powers and to become, acquire perfections in doing it. So this is not a pure libertarian notion of pluralism and diversity, although it doesn't criticize entirely the index of efficiency, but the better index is perfection.
So even if, for example, we could determine it's far better to raise children in daycare institutions, or let's say, that seems to be empirically questionable at this point, but also yes, thinking of, entrepreneurs or small business owners, that actually it would be far better to have just to try and regulate the economy in such a way that you have no less than, say, medium-sized business combinations, but largely, blue chip companies who are established. This would actually provide for more order within society, and yet entrepreneurialism is swiftly curved. And let's say that's true, but yet if it is true, then it seems to me people lose sort of a voluntaristic identity with their neighbors. They lose the judgment, the action mentality that comes from running a business or running an enterprise or something along those lines. So it's not an efficiency argument. It is, as you said, a perfection argument.
It's interesting because this is pretty standard for Catholic social and political theory, this position. But, it's not totally unrelated to Austrian school. If you stop and think about it, von Mises wrote on human action. And that even in the zone of economics, you can't just look at it from the standpoint of the consumer. That is, the end result in the order of efficiency is that I've got better stuff at lower prices. You also have to look at business from the standpoint of the agent. And this is absolutely crucial because a market is not just a coordinating device for consumers. Those kind of choices, it's a coordinating device also for people who are red-blooded agents, who are actually trying to make their households better, who are actually trying to start and maintain businesses, so on and so forth. So the agent-centered view of this is something I think at least some of the Austrian school economists and the Catholic theorists have in common.
Let me ask you this, and maybe we should have discussed this at the beginning, but I think this would be a good way to try and bring the interview to a close, and that's the really important discussion in scholasticism and politics of action and contemplation. And the revolution that Maritain says has been worked, largely, and it's been realized in certain respects within modernity, but through Christianity, and that what was formerly a drudgery work has become something perfective, seen as such. Also, government, which may have been open only to a few, or should be open only to a few, is now not. It's open to the many, and that breaking down that barrier, or seeing that through contemplation should come action. Talk about that for a minute, how that would relate to a political philosophy, to a modern state.
Well, the basic distinction comes out of Aristotle. When the very, very first sentences of the Ethics, Aristotle says, action is of two kinds. One is transitive and productive, in which the purpose of the action is to produce order in something external. But praxis is a kind of action in which the perfection is for the sake of the action itself. It resides in the agent. It terminates in the agent himself. And Maritain, by the way, he's by no means the only one who made this critique. We're suspicious of modern states. So we're talking about industrial era states into the 20th century. Is that government was all about production. It was into producing things, like we talk about candidate today, says, when I was governor, our gross state product. Everything is to be produced. And, what about action that is not just externally producible? And so, we make, for instance, in this country, what the Federal Register annually is about 80,000 pages, as I recall. We produce laws like soybeans. And people will brag about productivity. But, that's not capturing something important about political order. And by the way, none of us really like the notion that political authority is producing something in us or around us. So that's why that action contemplation is a very important thing. And by the way, action is praxical, where the perfection resides in the agent, is even for the sake of something greater than that, which is contemplation in the full sense of the term. Whether it's beauty or truth or whatever, that there are things about life that are not just to be produced or not just to be chosen and acted within practical reason, but things that are to be understood and enjoyed. In fact, those are the most shareable things. Stop and think about it. Photosynthesis, the truth of photosynthesis, it's not produced. It's and in some ways, it's not even our action. It's something shareable with everyone. It has a dignity to it precisely because it's a dimension of reality that is just not subject to our action and productivity.
I was wondering, thinking of the productivity of the modern state, and I was thinking, did Maritain offer thoughts on the summer of revolution in Europe of 1968?
Now, that's a very interesting question. By 68, well, he's certainly getting older. He only has 5 more years to live. And he's French, so he should have an opinion of the events of 1968, which imprinted the soul of France even more than they did over here in the United States. I can't recall direct comment about that, but he does start making comments about what's going on in the Catholic Church, which are kind of analogous. That is a overly politicized, a new kind of movement that wants to politicize, we think of liberation theology, that wanted to impatiently dismiss all matters of contemplation and beauty, wanted to make truth entirely an experiment of history. And so Maritain's two final books have a lot to say about that. One is called The Peasant of the Garonne, and the other one is called The Church of Christ, in which he is responding very passionately. Some people thought he shouldn't have written Peasant of the Garonne, very passionately to what could be called this postmodern moment in which, inherited culture and values and structures are just to be dismissed as getting in the way of the curve of history, this new curve of history, which is all political. And but about what happens in Paris, in the streets of Paris in '68, he may well have said something. I'm just not familiar with it.
Okay. You're wondering about that. Obviously, given the importance of the Parisian riots, and then I was thinking of his books, reflecting back on the church unfolding from Second Vatican Council. But yeah, maybe we do get a sense of that from these writings, given largely what happens in the colleges and universities. It takes a skip and a jump, but it does make its way into the seminaries, it seems, and makes its way into the formation of religious as well.
By the way, especially in South America, remember, Maritain was perhaps most read among the South Americans. I mean, he was really famous in South America, so that when by the late 60s he begins to see South American Catholics leaning toward a kind of Christian Marxist synthesis and this kind of thing, it pained him deeply.
Oh, interesting. Russ, I want to thank you for being with us today, and thank you for discussing scholasticism and politics and offering your tremendous reflections on Maritain's work. Thank you very much.
Indeed, my pleasure, and kudos to Liberty Fund for bringing it out again.
Thank you. This is your host, Richard Reinsch, and you have been listening to a podcast that can be found at libertylawtalk.org, where you can subscribe, comment, find other episodes, and links relevant to today's conversation. Our email address is mail@libertylawtalk.org.